Are you ready to perform at your highest potential? Thank you for joining this GP Strategies webinar, where we'll explore best practices and innovative insights to help you and your organization improve performance.
I want to thank you all for joining our session today, and I'm excited to introduce you to today's presenters. Our presenters today are Myles Runham. He is the Senior Analyst for Digital Learning at Fosway Group, Europe's #1 HR industry analyst. He has worked in online and digital businesses for over 20 years, 15 of those in the learning field. He has held a range of leadership positions from strategy, marketing, and project management through to managing director, each with a clear focus on the impact of digital technologies on customers, products, and services, and the future of the business. So we welcome you, Myles. And we also have, sorry, and we also have Karie Willyerd. She is the Chief Customer Strategies Officer for GP Strategies. She was the Chief Learning Officer for Visa and head of SAP's Global Education Business Unit and the Workplace Futurist at SuccessFactors. Prior to that, she served as the CLO for Sun Microsystems. She is the only CLO to have taken two companies to #1 in the world as recognized by ATD. Sun in 2014 and Visa in 2022. ATT also honored Karie with the Distinguished Contribution to Talent Development Award in 2017. So I also want to welcome you, Karie.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We have a great session planned today, and I'm just going to hand it off to you two, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Kim. And welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along. We're looking forward to a really useful and interesting conversation around this theme of steering learning functions through volatile terrain. I think we'll get onto this, but I think there's plenty of volatility around. So thanks very much, GP Strategies, as well for hosting and organizing. It's great to be here. What we'll do is we'll move on then to our objectives. So there's 5 areas that we'd like to cover today, and as Kim was saying, we hope to cover these in conversation, not just in presentation. So we have some material to share with you, some research to share from Fosway and from GP Strategies, but we really want this to be a conversation. Karie and I are intending to talk these themes through, but we want to hear from you as well. So please do put questions, comments in the chat as we go. We'll do what we can to address them, but please do. We want to have a conversation with you as much as we do with each other. So we want to firstly think a little bit about what does volatile terrain look like? What does this mean? What kind of volatility are we experiencing? And how do those sources of disruption impact on learning? How strong are learning and development foundations to deal with these changes? What might we need to do to support them or add to those foundations? What kinds of responses might work best in volatile times? And how might you start to apply those? Probably the most, so at least whether it's the most important, it's certainly the most talked about disruption at the moment, source of transformation, perhaps an opportunity as well, is AI. So we're going to spend some time thinking about the impact of AI on learning and the impact of AI on particularly on workplace learning and learning and development functions. And lastly, we'll cover the theme of working with suppliers. Approach the market to try and deal with these strategic themes. So those are our 5 themes that we'll go through. I don't know, Karie, is there anything you want to add in commentary before we kick off?
I don't think so. We'll look forward to hearing comments in chat, and we'll respond as we go on questions. So looking forward to it.
Great, thank you. So firstly, I mean, this is a little bit of a summary of a research paper that we worked on with GP Strategies over the summer of this year. And we were looking at trying to sort of establish a little bit of the landscape of disruption. So what is it that learning leaders are facing in terms of disruption? Group these into external and internal factors. Anticipate that most of these will be familiar to you. So I mean, these, you know, it's sort of it can seem dramatic, but we've seen obviously the theme of the recovery from the pandemic, the disruption that that's caused and perhaps still causing. There's themes of energy security, economics, price inflation, and certainly particularly important in some markets. Digital and agile transformation ongoing, artificial intelligence arriving. I suppose it's been around, but arriving perhaps in as a more immediate opportunity and concern in the last 12 months, matched by internal factors. So the sort of the skills imperative. The differing gets perhaps expectations of the workforce about how you work, where you work, the kind of interaction and engagement and contract you have with your employer, digital fatigue, comms overload. There's a lot going on here, Karie. I mean, I guess it would be interesting from your perspective. Now, how do you see from your network of, your CLO network and your experience, how do you see these kinds of disruptions coming to life and impacting learning particularly? What is it about learning that we need to grapple with when we're thinking about these kinds of forces?
Well, I think, I think there's several things. One, everybody's still trying to figure out how can we move to more of a skills-based hiring and development in order to help solve the skills availability issue. So you see a lot of people wrestling with that. Walmart recently made an announcement that they're going to remove the degree as a requirement on a majority of their jobs. And they're still researching how do they validate that you have the skills because the degree is always served as a proxy for skills. So how can they better manage that? So lots of energy around that. Of course, a lot of energy around generative AI and what that's going to mean at several levels for our company. Because, at the company level, places like Chegg are lost, 60% of the value of their company in one day when they announced that that students were starting to use Gen AI in lieu of Chegg. So, or at the how do we support the transition or transformation of talent required across the organization? And then finally, for our own functions, where can we best leverage L&D and the learning function? I mean, that's just picking two things. We could go on to all of these, I'm sure, Myles, but those two have a lot of energy right now.
Yeah. No, that's right. And I think it's interesting as well how those they combine a little as well as you said, a sort of the signals from education that used to be so relied on, say, here's a source of skills and capability through into the workforce, that we can't rely on those signals so much now. So having to work harder to understand what that skills readiness looks like. Yeah. Important. So one of the things that we've looked at in our research at the Fosway group, perhaps starting on the right-hand side of this slide, this is from our HR realities research over the last year or so, of these top 3 initiatives that organizations, HR leaders and learning leaders looking to sort of future-proof their organization. So against those sources of disruption, as you mentioned, Karie, skills, capability, and how do you enable and bridge those gaps? How do you identify those gaps? As you said, how do you try and empower everyone in the workforce? So all talent and all potential. So this isn't just about the sort of the high potentials or certain, leadership cadres. This is for everyone. And also they're sort of building lifelong learning as a source of resilience as well. And against that, perhaps on the left-hand side, we've got traditional L&D approaches, so that design and deliver as a shorthand for this focus on program delivery, making content available, and very much a kind of, in technology terms, a systems-led experience. And then there's this pressure now from the need for intelligence in our solutions. They need to be responsive, flexible, evidence-based, data-rich, etc. So, how do you see these things playing out? Do you think, do you recognize this picture in the first question, and then, do you see that these traditional approaches under pressure?
Yeah. Interesting that you actually selected the titles and prepared this slide, but my last book was called How to Future-Proof Yourself for Tomorrow's Workplace. And we did research, it was while I was with SAP, and we did research across the world. And a really interesting thing was that the number one answer people gave us for how do they future-proof themselves is by hanging around smart people and creating community. And so I also, So I think that's embedded in here because it's the lifelong learning and resilience, and in empowering talent requires community and learning from each other because there's just so much to learn. I think there's 1,000 papers a month published on AI now, and 1,000 new applications a month. Nobody can keep up with all of that. So webinars like this, Myles, I think are one of the ways in which people do try and stay up to date and help future-proof by just knowing what research is out there and what other companies are doing.
So is there something then as well, Karie, maybe behind that or sort of amongst that of L&D's function to kind of help connect sources of expertise and experience in the it's not just about delivery of knowledge and skills programs, it's about connecting the organization almost with itself so that to help it and facilitate those conversations?
Yes, definitely. And I think that's got to create just some space for, you've probably said this yourself sometimes when you've gone to a conference or a workshop, you've said it was great, but the best part was I learned from others. And so just structuring the time for people to be able to learn from each other and not just the content that we're keen to get across. And, I've talked to some people who are reimagining their campuses as places for casual meetups as well. They're learning campuses to have opportunities for people to connect on issues without necessarily having programmed content to be delivered at the time, but more brown bag, get together, talk about what you want kind of thing. Hosted.
And I guess, and perhaps there's something there as well, making the most of those, when we do get together physically, making the most of that as a kind of social moment as well as, sort of a work moment, or adding that kind of, designing socially into those things as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's
allowing for serendipity.
Sorry, go ahead.
Allowing for serendipity.
Allow people to take their time.
Mm-hmm.
There's an interesting. I'd like to get your view on this, Karie. Actually, so we had Janie in the chat has referenced multi-generation workforce as a real challenge for learning design. I mean, how are you seeing that? I think we've seen it in our research that it puts a pressure on expectations of the organization from I don't want to make generalizations about different generations, but there tend to be expectations of what being an employee means, about career growth, about opportunity, about length of tenure and loyalty, etc. How do you think those play out for learning leaders in offering development and steering that skills development perhaps?
Well, again, from some of the research we did for our last book is one of the things we explored as well. And I think, it's interesting. I've got a blog on this in Harvard Business Review. People of all generations value learning and development as part of their career development. And I think sometimes people assume, well, baby boomers have learned everything they need to know. In fact, it's one of their top job satisfiers is continuing to learn. That's one of the reasons they stay working, is the ability to keep on learning and to be vital and to contribute. So I think there are some things that we might assume it'd be better to look through the research to see that, in fact, they are engaged. And a second thing that was really interesting is that the least favorite learning for every generation was non-interactive e-learning. That's the least favorite. People would far rather, go to a class or be able to get learning on the moment or something that's cohort based and engaging. So that's kind of true across all generations. Then you start to get into, interestingly, the youngest workers, and this has been true for a long time, are keener to be in office and to be in live classrooms because they're building a network, they're establishing relationships that could serve them their entire careers at the company, and beyond, even as people go to different companies. So I think it's important to, figure out all of those. I think her question is mostly around when you're doing it as e-learning, and by that I think adding community in, even having some cohort-based moments when there's e-learning, even if it's just open office hours, can be helpful.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think we're going to move on now to our first poll. So thanks everybody, and do keep your comments coming in the chat as well. We definitely want to hear more questions and comments as we go. I'll move on. We're going to start talking a little bit about sort of senior C-suite relationships now as a theme for, I suppose, strategic relevance for learning. So our first poll question, which hopefully you can see: does your C-suite see learning and people development as central to the success of your organization? Completely, somewhat, or not at all? So it's perhaps we're slightly reducing it for the purposes of the poll. So I think we've got, see some of the responses coming in. We've got somewhat, probably ahead of completely. So thank you everybody. Keep the responses coming in. We'll move on to reveal that in a moment. I think I have a few more. And I think Karie, I don't want to get ahead of the answer that we see, but I think again, you know, in a lot of the work we've done, particularly in our corporate network, this theme of senior stakeholder relationships, however you define it, feels like a really kind of important foundation for a lot of the other things that come after that. Without those relationships, you'll really struggle for some of those, you know, strategic levers that you were describing earlier as well. So it's been interesting to see, you know, how people respond to that question.
And you know what I find really ironic is that in CEO polls, you'll see their concerns about do they have the talent they need to compete as usually their number one or number two concern, but it doesn't translate to this question as much, because maybe they don't see the connection between the learning and development function and the ability to have the talent they need to compete in the future.
Yeah, interesting point. Maybe it's a sort of a preoccupation with seeing learning and development as having a sort of narrow or conducting a narrow set of activities. So back to that kind of design and deliver, perhaps, rather than a lot of the more sort of mature and sophisticated, I guess, and progressive designs that you were mentioning. So what we saw in our own research, we had I think that this matches a little bit matching our poll results. So we saw that, you know, 43% who have that completely central to the success of the organization, somewhat 51%. So I don't know, when I look at these results, Karie, I kind of, sometimes I see the glass as half full, sometimes I see it as half empty. I don't know how this reflects with your experience, but I think, you know, I guess it's to what you're saying. Part of the answer to this could be, how is L&D seen in the organization, and therefore how do they cast that contribution that it can make?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting paradox.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe if we move on to the next slide, because I think this starts to, and this is your research here, Karie. So I don't know if you want to maybe talk through this a bit, because I think this starts to address some of the themes that you were talking about.
Yeah, we were interested. This is a watershed survey that is available now, by the way. You can, so I put a post on LinkedIn where you can connect to the watershed survey. But we wanted to see how much people were using analytics. And so we laid out kind of four ways the organization could be perceived. And we went from, if you start on the right, a shared service organization, or valued service provider, or aligned with performance and talent and the business, or strategic partner. And you can see it almost split up in four. So you know, and I don't know. I know that I remember going in interviewing once for the CLO position at Sun Microsystems, and the founder, Scott McNeely, asked me, "So, what are you going to be? Are you going to be a person who receives my orders and fulfills them?" And I said, "Yes, and and I'm a professional, and so I should bring some insights to the business on how we should be advancing and developing our people." So that turned out to be the right answer, because I got hired. But I think a lot of people stay on the right-hand side, and feel like that is, and so maybe there is a a CEO longing for more that we just haven't stepped up.
That's almost untapped there, that
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
looking for more, but
untapped.
don't to look and they don't know how to start that conversation, perhaps.
Miles, it's almost like my husband always remembers our anniversaries and birthdays, but it would be just nice to get a surprise gift every once in a while,
Okay. I understand the analogy. I'm not going to comment on your husband's gift giving habits, but I think I take the point. Yeah.
And so maybe on the left is, can we offer up gifts every once in a while that aren't just expected,
Yeah. More than the chocolates and the flowers. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we've had it. There's a comment from Jenna about that in their organization, looking at sort of this idea of moving the needle from training towards that skills and capability. So something to do expressed as a sort of an L&D brand within the brand, which is an interesting way of thinking about what's your brand for your function or for your service.
Right. And how tied is it to, I've met CLOs who say, I'm only responsible for the learning I deliver. I'm not responsible for learning across the organization. And I've said, then what does the title chief mean then in chief learning officer if you're not responsible for all of it? So that means, how do we ensure that we have systems for how people can learn on the job? I think a chief learning officer is responsible for helping create that and enabling a culture that lets people learn and on the job, even though that's not part of programs that you're developing and issuing. It doesn't mean you have control over everything, but you have a responsibility to enable.
I think that's interesting, isn't it? That sense of control, of maybe there's that. Kim, I think could you put yourself on mute again? Sorry, you came off and it was cutting across a little. I think it's interesting that there is that focus. Perhaps it's partly to do with the way roles are structured, but that sense of I'm in charge of what I can control. So that's my budget, my team, my outputs, or my programming, as you said. Whereas I think it's that sort of being more of a partner and an influencer as well, which is maybe it's kind of harder work perhaps, but it's and it sort of edges into organizational politics and informal influencing in relationships, but that feels like it's an important sort of set of skills and confidence to develop.
Yeah, and I think it's about are you willing to step up and take accountability for helping move the needle on things? So I would always sign up for, yes, I'll agree to people answer that they feel they have access to learning and development opportunities within the company, even though I can't possibly influence all of that. Every manager can deny or support people in L&D, but somebody's got to own it at the executive level. And so I think that also sends a message of we're not just program pushers.
Yeah, good point. I think maybe that's a good moment and there's a few comments as well, actually, that I think probably pick up alongside this slide. If maybe we'll come to those. I suppose this is some Fosway data that and again, this slide both kind of encourages me and disheartens me. And this maybe that's just me, but I think we sort of start to see at the bottom here some progress from previous data about mobilizing around strategic organizational priorities. I think we've seen that in some of the chat as well, of saying your connection with articulated business goals that gives you your kind of foundation of value in the organization. And then some of the other tactical stuff, but at the top, then I think this sort of the confidence and capability in measuring impact and the ability to describe, I suppose, analyze and describe and make the case for the performance and productivity that you're generating is much weaker. So I feel sort of encouraged a little bit on the bottom and slightly disheartened on the top. I don't know how you see it, Karie, and if you want to maybe reflect on some of the comments we've had in, which I think are sort of around similar themes as well.
Yeah, I mean, I know we all want to be better in terms of the advanced, and then unfortunately real life gets in. I mean, during COVID it wasn't unusual to get fairly severe budget cuts, and you're just maybe recovering from that. And so, have the ideas and know how to get there, but, just trying to keep up with the everyday can sometimes be overwhelming. So, on some of these. So at least they're, self-aware to say there's room to grow.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, yeah, and I think that fits with some of the comments as well. I think interesting that Jenna mentioned that there's and this is something that I think perhaps when I was running elements and functions in learning, that governance can tie us back to business goals, and I think governance can be something that we are maybe, again, perhaps this was just my experience, but we can sort of shy away from or see as overly formal and structural. But governance handled well can be a friend in keeping you tied to those goals and tied to the sort of the most important requirements of the organization.
Governance is just a huge topic, and we could do an hour session on
I did slightly hesitate
governance.
when I said it out loud, but yes.
Yeah, because I've been I've been a CLO 6 times, so I've had a chance to try and refine it, every time. And I have found the least effective form of governance was when I had just like one panel at the top of the organization to provide guidance, because they couldn't do the level of specificity really needed to tie to the business. And so governance becomes then, lots of committees that you are coordinating with. It's a huge time investment to really get it right on governance and business alignment. I think
it's a good point, actually, but I think that maybe that's something that perhaps puts people off. It's there are no shortcuts. It's about it's about structure, it's about the relationships, it's about communication and reporting, and it's an always on activity, isn't it? There's no app for it. It's a kind of a constant part of your role.
It's not once a year.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's a good point.
And if those pesky business owners would just keep on doing the same thing, all the time, and not having their business environments change, requiring a change, so.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I guess, and that was something that we spoke about, excuse me, in preparation for this as well, is one of the things that is increasingly demanded from employees is much more of a personal experience that reflects your context and your maybe your motivations, your role, your goals, more about me, and balancing that then with those kind of overarching business goals or strategic goals can be it's not always simple. I mean, do you recognize that tension, and how have you seen that work best, resolving it, if you do recognize it?
Well, that's almost a rhetorical question, right? Because
it was rather, yes, well spotted.
Yeah, because it's so complex. So, I agree with the challenges laid out in the question, and so it's a constant adjustment.
Yeah, and I suppose part of it plays back to that theme, excuse me, of having that intelligence and data about both the big picture and the individual. Those individual contexts as well. We're going to move on, and do keep your questions and thoughts coming in, everybody. It's really good to see that. I think it's really interesting and encouraging to see these different approaches to governance and different approaches to how you balance your time against those. And we're going to start change pace and change tack a little bit now. So we're going to think a little bit more now about a particularly important and very well spoken about. There's a lot of conversation around artificial intelligence, particularly generative AI and its impact on learning. So we've got a poll question here about how much do you think generative AI will change your organization in the next 3 years? So a little bit, little to none, some, on the edge, or a profound amount. I'm really interested to hear the result of this. Actually, I keep changing my mind about the extent and speed of impact. I think, and almost because the amount of activity and the amount of product and technology releases that are coming out at the moment, it feels like the landscape's almost changing on a daily, if not weekly basis. That I keep changing my own sentiment and judgment on this one. So I'll be interested to see what our audience make of it. So we've got, excuse me, hang on a second.
Yeah, it looks like about 10% here are in the little to none, but about half in saying some. And I think that's interesting. I run a poll like this probably a couple of times a week, and it tends to be a little more at the high end of
Right.
profound amounts. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that's probably what I've seen as well, is more of that expectation of a lot of change more quickly in general.
Mhm.
Yeah. Let's compare that to, so we've got, and they're going to show a couple of data points that we gather. This is from some Fosway research we ran with learning professionals over the summer. So we've seen, so against that anticipation and expectation, we're seeing sort of at the moment probably a moderate amount of impact now. And this is probably from maybe, I think this was sort of August, September time. So and it's a kind of, it's a pretty nice even spread. So a moderate amount that's being seen now, so some seeing none at all yet, which is, I think it's always important to remember that. And against that, on the right hand side, we've seen, perhaps this is more of what you've seen in previous polls as well, Karie. We saw, in this instance, anticipated impact in 12 months, and we'd seen a great deal of impact being expected in 12 months time, which I don't know what you think. My take on that is probably a little bit too much too soon. There are some barriers and issues with implementation, but I don't know, how do you reflect on this data anyway, because I know that this is something you've been looking at in depth and having a lot of conversations, doing quite a lot of research around.
Yeah. Well, so personally, I just want to make sure I'm up to date on this, and the nature of my job is strategy now. So I'm almost completing a course at MIT on AI and strategy. And I went to the TED TED had a special conference 3 weeks ago in San Francisco on AI. And so I spent a lot of time immersed in this space, and I'm more in a great deal camp, just because I've seen what's coming to some degree. Sam Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI, was speaking at one of the conferences I was at, and he said, somebody asked him how he's spending his time, and he had almost this throwaway line where he said, well, of course, what we've released already is just a primitive version of what we really have. And so, so he said he's out there working with governments to prepare them for the changes that are coming. I also think that we're a frequent phrase that people are using now is human in the loop.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is going to be, at least at the beginning, a lot of human in the loop in order to supervise the AI and to make sure that it's safe and responsible and ethical. And as it gets more and more trained, I think it's going to be very profound. So it depends on what timeline we're talking about here.
Yeah.
But I'm excited about some of the things I'm seeing. I mean, there's just a problem I've always had was translation. And so you'd release something, and if you had a really ample budget, you might be able to translate to 7 languages. And I've seen apps over the last 3 or 4 weeks that are arguably as good as or better than our traditional translation methods, where you type a text, an avatar, and it could look like you, Myles, so can be very deep fake, talking, and then translated it at the touch of a button into 100 languages. So so think about how easy that is to update. That's always been a problem with videos, much less being 100 languages, and your lips are moving whether you're speaking Chinese or whether you're speaking Spanish or English. Your lips move in sync to for so many things, that's going to be one. And I don't know that it's going to be replacing humans. It's giving us the opportunity to personalize so much more. Now we could deliver in 100 languages,
I think it's interesting. I think something that actually I'm going to save my question, because there was a couple of remarks here that sort of people calling out the fact that I think this is referring to generative AI, but let me know if I'm misrepresenting the question here about that it can't. That these systems are not good yet at understanding why they're right or why something's wrong. So that sense of being able to explain and make what we might call that judgment. I mean, do you recognize that? Do you think that's a risk, or is that something that technologies will start to develop and work through that as almost as a kink?
Well, there is no user manual for these large. There's about 10 major large language models and another 10 smaller ones right now. And there's no user's manual because it is learning inside. So even the people who created it are finding out how to best navigate it. So what we're finding is that with bad prompting, you're going to get bad results and you're going to get wrong information. And that's why I think there's going to have to be a lot of skill building around how to be a good prompter, how to pull out and find the best information, and why there will still need to be humans in the loop until we do that. So companies are starting to build up these prompt libraries that would go into every prompt that just kind of attach it, silently or invisibly to every prompt, so that you help get the right information out of it. An example: somebody wrote a research paper on tasks that they wanted. The task is called the traveling salesman. It's where you try and solve for a salesman has to go to 5 cities. What's the quickest route? It's a mental problem and a math problem that's been around for a long time. So these researchers tried 4 prompts. One was use your logic and a little math and come up with the answer to this problem. And the problem is always stated the same. The best prompt was take a deep breath before answering this. Now use a little math and logic. And I thought, how could that be possible? It doesn't have a breath. So how could take a deep breath be the way? So that's what I'm saying. We're discovering how to, but somewhere inside this, machine is this recognition that take a deep breath means you've got to do a few other things here before you start right into the task.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw a research or summary of a research paper. It was comparing the response of, I think it was GPT-4, its bedside manner with patients versus the date. This was not versus a human; it was versus the sort of the standard that they see of patients' judgment of bedside manner, and it was as good, if not better, on responding to what we might call, it might call, or we call, an emotional cue. And I think it's interesting. It's sort of, maybe that starts to get close to the creepy line for people, but it's interesting how effective that kind of judgment and how effective these systems can be in sort of reflecting back what we would expect to see, and from those cues.
I saw a cardiologist at the TED conference from Stanford who said that now they submit X-rays to the machine to interpret, and the X-ray can determine, chest X-ray can determine gender and race, and humans can't. And humans can't even figure out how it's interpreting and figuring out gender and race. So it can do things that humans can't do. And so in medicine, I think this is going to be phenomenal. I think in drug discovery and in many other things, but it's an infant. And so it's going to need a lot of human training still and understanding. But I think someday we'll discover, how does it know race from a chest X-ray? And that's going to advance our medical knowledge somehow as well.
Interesting.
So yeah.
It's interesting. You mentioned that it's a child that's growing. I think that the phrase adult supervision's come up in the chat whilst we were speaking, as that sort of anticipation. And I guess that's one way of describing that kind of human intervention. There's one question I don't want to, at the risk of dwelling here, but I think there's something interesting you mentioned in passing, Karie, which I think feels like it could be important in the L&D context around the a lot of focus on efficiency benefits, so cost and speed around content creation and authoring, so making learning content, very simply put. And it feels like there's going to be a huge impact there because it's so, that kind of pattern recognition is so powerful in our context in digital learning. And that versus you reference the opportunity for personalization, and perhaps this is real personalization rather than kind of rules-based segmentation that might have been masquerading as personalization. I don't know. I think it feels interesting. I can see in the conversation I've been having and the research that we've been doing, there's a sort of both an excitement and a nervousness about that efficiency point.
Yeah.
And maybe not enough focus yet on the personalization. I don't know. How do you see, from the conversations you're having and what you've seen?
Well, first off, I think, a helpful metaphor, and not an entirely accurate metaphor, but a helpful metaphor is to think back when the internet first was open. People said, we will never allow the internet in our companies, because of all the danger and the, security. And of course, there's almost no company that doesn't somehow use at least an intranet. So we've put enterprise guardrails around it. So there are lots of companies coming up now that are helping you figure out how to use the enterprise guardrails, and where your information you're using isn't from the training database that the large language model started on, but on your own vectorized database of content. And so I've seen, there's a company called Uplimit that has a learning delivery platform and a learning content development, and it's the only content it's pulling from is what they have pointed it to. So it's not going, someone says, it's the old internet and so on. That's the unpaid versions of one of the large language models. As I said, there are 10 large language models. So ChatGPT is not the only large language model that's out there. And so I think this is going to show up as completely embedded in our work. I mean, Microsoft's put over $1 billion into OpenAI. It's going to show up in releases this month from Microsoft in ways in which you're working and things can get scheduled and things can get done to improve productivity. And it's not going to be the open internet that people worried about in the, in the 80s. But it's going to have guardrails around it that will help get it safer and safer.
Yeah, interesting. And it does seem that those guardrails are much more part of the conversation about applying these systems than they were about the open internet as well. That's a good point. I think we're going to move on. I could talk about this topic actually endlessly. It's fascinating, but let's get some input from the audience again, perhaps reflecting on some of that and some of the themes in the chat around governance, supervision, and about predictability. So for you folks out there, how ready do you feel your organization is to harness the potential of AI? Is this something that you're feeling that you're profoundly ready for this, or just a little bit, or you're on the edge of it? I think this is an interesting point and I think for me, Karie, this has been one area where I've seen a bit of a break on the expectations and the enthusiasm and the potential as the reality, particularly in large organizations, and and then depending on your sector and levels of regulation, etc. Actually bringing this potential to life then becomes much more complex. So I think we've seen. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. We have just a little delay time between over the pond and over to Colorado.
Absolutely.
So what I find interesting is that the companies I'm talking to, some of them that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be on the cutting edge of this are. So John Deere. They have Deere AI inside the organization to really help with their knowledge management. I mean, I think knowledge management has been a real problem. And of course, it's still there's a human in the loop, that interprets the results and helps look at. But there are lots of ways to solve for this now. So it's like an enterprise guardrail, for example, that's embedded in every prompt could be only return publish sources from deer.com, and B, always cite your source. So the person can go back and look it up. It's not the lawyer who had made up case law. So that's not what we're talking about inside the enterprise. Inside the enterprise, it's going to be much more sophisticated and accurate.
I think it's interesting as well how that could be a balance against what we've seen as some of the unpredictability, the outputs of these models. I know that they're all, you know, as you said, all of them, not just ChatGPT, working very hard to manage those what become known as hallucinations. But I think that that's one of the things about that I think is interesting. To some of the resistance that I've seen, or some of the anxiety I've seen, is that sense of unpredictable outcomes. Thinking here not about broader AI, but about generative AI, is the fact that one of the things that was so attractive, I think, and so interesting as we first discovered it and used it a year ago in the workplace context, actually it's answered my same prompt differently 3 times, and you know, is that okay? You know, does that matter? And I think it feels like it's some interesting kind of design principles perhaps that we need to be aware of in using those tools in the workplace context.
Yeah. Well, I think there's no one on this call who doesn't have to learn how to write good prompts in 2 years' time. That's going to be part of, you know, knowing how to, it's a different kind of communication skill.
Yes, it's interesting. So I'm going to just to show my age a bit, and maybe as a sort of play a bit of devil's advocate against that. So I used to work in the search engine industry a very long time ago, and we were seeing at that time there were a lot of courses on how to search the internet. So people would go for a half-day course on how to search, how to use text, how to use image search, you know, what to look out for in shopping search, etc. And all of those courses have gone now because the technology got much better, and it sort of disambiguates for you. Do you think that might happen with generative AI, that actually that they will help us prompt by, you know?
Well, it will help us prompt in, and I think the enterprise will wrap a library of embedded prompts that go along with every prompt. So you might just say, somebody said, write my bio, whereas inside and attached to it will be 100 more sentences of prompt than the person originally put in their prompt. And that's how it'll kind of like, you know, refer to LinkedIn or refer to Workday, you know, and as sources.
Interesting. And well, we've got another slide to get to, but I just wanted to check on the there's been a reference to Frankenstein in the chat. I think I don't know if you saw that, Karie, but there was one thing.
Yeah.
I think I don't know. Again, I don't want to get but I think it's an interesting metaphor for how these things, you know, could be designed and the risk and the potential. Go ahead. Sorry, I cut you.
Yeah, I think and I think I'm cutting you off. I think I heard a speaker had done a TED Talk that had been watched a couple million times. She was one of the people who first recognized that facial recognition wasn't recognizing her properly. She's from Ghana, and she had very dark skin. And so the facial recognition wasn't interpreting her properly. So now she's got she works for the American Justice League for equity and inclusion in AI. And she said things like, you know, the click languages, for example, that the Bushmen use in, you know, in Africa, they're not represented in what's developing in these AI LLMs. It's largely European and some Asian languages, but primarily English that is training the models. So just by using English, as the model that these are getting trained on, there's a bit of lack of inclusion and bias of the worldview, much less all the way down to how people who are using it more might be influencing it. So there's lots of levels of training influence that are going on in these models.
Yeah, true. And what's your view, Karie, on how these technologies and these tools might change, you know, sort of the ways that L&D teams and functions need to work? Perhaps that might be the capabilities we need, or how we organize around projects, or, you know, how we bring in expertise, etc. If we had a conversation earlier about the traditional foundations are actually perhaps not great for those external disruptions, the implication from that is that those foundations are not necessarily going to be the best, but the opportunities and the risks of these new tools.
Yeah. So as I said, there's 1,000 new applications coming out every month, and a lot of those applications are trying to include some guardrails and referring to a structured piece of content to work from as opposed to the open internet. But I can imagine a day when, Myles, you say, you go to a prompt or you speak out loud to say, put together a 10-minute course for me on topic X. And that course is instantaneously put together. It's not that course that's put together inside your work environment would have had some learning and development people in the loop who have said, whenever anybody asks a question about creating a course, make sure they go to this place, make sure it includes, like, people are saying things, make sure it includes Bloom's principles of learning, and so there's somebody who has been training the LLM for the prompt whenever anybody says, develop a course for me. And that's the super personalization that can happen, is not that we've thought up all the courses people might ask for, but that we've set the rules in place so that any course could be developed on the fly, and we have some confidence that it's going to be a legitimate course pulled from our authorized content.
Yeah, okay, so that's a bit more color to what human intervention could look like, is those kind of processing guardrails and policy decisions around the technology that keep it, I suppose, keep it boundaried in a way that is most valuable, least distracting, but also, I suppose, safe as well.
Right, and having content available that can be reconstructed in the moment for someone. And so there's still going to be a content creation that is not these large language models can only generate based on content they already know. They can't generate on content that they don't know. Like, we release a new version of software, it doesn't know what that is until we feed it into it, or we release a new model of a widget, it's not going to know that. Or there's a new concept that hasn't been discussed before, it can't it can't do those things.
It can only react to the input. There's a question in the Q&A actually around, which is building on that a little bit and managing internal expectations. So how can we sell AI to leadership as a technology to adopt as part of our growth strategy? Some concerns from leadership about sharing information external to the organization, the kind of bleeding of internal data into public domain through these models.
Yeah. So I think in almost all cases, there's very little advocacy for what you should do is just open up a prompt to ChatGPT Turbo inside the organization. Instead, it is going to be using our proprietary information, and those kind of applications or systems that people are using inside. So that would happen, for example, within the Microsoft Azure environment. The content only comes one way, and it doesn't come, your content that's generated doesn't go back out. There's a filter. It doesn't go back to train the large language model, and in fact doesn't go back to train your own applications in order to keep data discrete. So there's a lot of loops and protections here. Everybody's kind of thinking it's just open access to, and that's not going to happen, because you'd be feeding proprietary information and training somebody else's large language model. So that's not the way it's going to work. What I think we should be advocating for is finding good help. So, go to the companies. There are companies like NVIDIA is one of the chips that powers the AI capability. They have teams that are helping companies figure out, how will I use AI? There are some great small consulting firms that'll give you some prototypes for 50 grand. Tribe AI is one of those. Microsoft will. And so Tribe is a partner to OpenAI. And that's how it's going to happen. It's not that we should say, company, let's open up and let everybody have access and do their work off of. That's not the way it'll happen.
No, I think you're right. Everybody, these services and the technology providers are very alert to these challenges, aren't they? Well, I think we might do, Karie, because we're almost out of time. We have one more slide. I might skip that though, because I think, and maybe we could just go. I don't know, Kim, if we've had any other questions and comments. We've still got, I think, a couple of minutes. If there's anything we could cover from the Q&A before we wrap. I must admit, I've been looking at the chat, but not the Q&A. So I don't know, Kim, if there's anything there that we could reflect on quickly.
No, I don't see anything right now. I mean, the chat has been really popular, which is good. But if anybody does have any questions, you can throw them in the Q&A. We do have about 3 minutes left. But if you see anything, I did see something just come through.
Yeah, and there's a company that I work with called UpLimit that has an AI Academy. I saw somebody saying AI Academy. So UpLimit has an AI Academy where you can either have just buy seats in the academy, or you can as a company buy private sessions. And the interesting thing with them is the platform that they deliver on is AI fueled. So you get the chance to experience robotic TAs and moderators nudging you. And so they've got incredible completion rates on their course as a result of finding out when are the moments when people are most likely to drop out and how do you keep them engaged and so on.
Brilliant. I think it's interesting. I suppose I don't have a specific recommendation for myself, Karie, other than I think you're right about entirely agree about experimentation. Get out there. We all have a kind of, I suppose, a personal and professional responsibility to try and keep up to date. It's tough, but also to sort of get involved and test and try some of these tools and applications to try and work out what we think is most useful and relevant in our own context. Easy to say, not so hard, but maybe a little bit hard to do because it is moving fast, as you said.
Yeah, it is. And like on the UpLimit courses, for example, they actually teach the content with live folks who are studying in the field because it's changing so fast. You couldn't possibly it daily. So.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks everybody. Kim, I'll hand over to you. I think we're out of time, but that's been I've enjoyed that anyway. So thanks very much, Karie, for joining us.
It was an amazing discussion, and I want to thank you, Myles and Karie, for your time and expertise. Key takeaway: human in the loop. Right? Keep human in the loop. Anyway, thank you everybody for joining us today, for your time and attention. At the end of this session, we do ask that you take a minute to fill out our survey to make our presentations as great as possible with your feedback. We hope you'll join us again for another one of our upcoming webinars. Visit GP Strategy's website to view the future sessions, and I wish everyone on the call a wonderful and productive rest of your day. Thank you again.
This webinar was brought to you by GP Strategies. Together, we help organizations transform through their people. You can access more webinars or download additional resources by visiting the GP Strategies Resource Library. The link is on your screen and in the description.